Sometimes the world throws away exactly what we need most. Sometimes love grows strongest in the hardest ground. In 1847, the town council of Cedar Falls gave mountain man Jedediah Cain a woman they considered worthless, Ruthie Bell, poor and unwanted. They laughed, thinking she'd be gone by spring. But Ruthie didn't just survive the mountain. She learned to hunt, trap, and heal. She gave Jed 3 strong sons, who would become legends. The same men who once mocked this union now tip their hats when the Cain family rides to town. But how did a woman everyone had given up on become the foundation of the territory's most respected family? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather-bound journal lay open on the rough-hewn table, its pages filled with careful notations in Jedediah Cain's steady hand. February 12th, 1847, wind from the northwest, temperature dropping fast. Checked the snares this morning, found 2 rabbits frozen solid. Ice on the creek, thick enough to walk on. The entries stretched back 7 years, each one a testament to solitude, each page a record of conversations he'd had only with himself. Jedediah closed the journal and set down his pen, the scratch of the nib against paper, the only sound in the one-room cabin that had been his world since he'd fled civilization. Outside, the Montana winter pressed against the walls like a living thing, seeking entry through every gap in the chinked logs. The wind howled down from the peaks with a voice that could drive lesser men to madness, but Jed had learned to find comfort in its constancy. At least the wind never lied to him, never promised what it couldn't deliver, never turned its back when times grew hard. The cabin itself stood as a monument to stubborn determination. Every log had been felled, stripped, and notched by his own hands. The stone fireplace rose from fieldstones he'd gathered from the creek bed, each one selected for its ability to hold heat through the long winter nights. A rough table, 2 chairs, though he'd never needed the second hand, a bed frame that had known only his own restless sleep. Shelves lined one wall, filled with the tools of mountain survival, traps, skinning knives, ammunition, and the few books he'd brought from his old life in Missouri. The works of Shakespeare seemed out of place among the beaver pelts and bear fat, but on the longest nights, when the silence grew too heavy, Hamlet's soliloquies provided the only human voice he'd hear for weeks. The morning routine never varied. Before dawn, he'd stoke the fire that had burned low through the night, then step into the bitter air to check his snares and trap lines. The wilderness provided, but only for those who understood its harsh mathematics. Every resource was precious, every mistake potentially fatal. He'd learned to read the sky like scripture, to know by the color of the clouds whether he had hours or days before the next storm. His hands, once soft from clerking in his father's store, had grown calloused and sure, capable of setting a trap in complete darkness or stitching a wound by firelight. Down in Cedar Falls, 20 miles of treacherous mountain trails away, the town struggled through its own version of winter survival. The settlement had grown up around the confluence of 2 streams, its buildings huddled together like sheep against the cold. Main Street stretched barely 3 blocks, lined with the essential businesses that kept frontier life possible. Holbrook's General Store, Morrison's Saloon, the Territorial Bank, Dr. Whitman's medical practice, and the Frontier Inn where travelers could find a bed and a hot meal if they had the coin. Mayor Augustus Holbrook commanded the town from behind the counter of his general store, his considerable bulk wrapped in wool vests, and his opinions expressed with the authority of a man who controlled credit and supplies. At 52, he'd seen Cedar Falls grow from a collection of tents to what he generously called civilization, though he harbored dreams of something grander, a real city, with paved streets, gas lamps, and the kind of prosperity that came from mining strikes or railroad stops. Councilman Edgar Davies, thin as a fence post and twice as rigid, served as Holbrook's most reliable voice in town decisions. Davies owned the only other substantial business, the grain mill, and believed firmly that progress required difficult choices and practical solutions to inconvenient problems. His wife had died 3 winters past, leaving him with a bitter certainty that sentiment was a luxury Cedar Falls couldn't afford. Sheriff Tom Morrison maintained order with a calm competence that belied his 60 years. He'd worn a badge in 5 different territories, following the frontier westward as civilization caught up with him. Morrison understood that law on the frontier was more about preventing trouble than punishing it after the fact, and he'd earned respect through fairness rather than fear. His weathered face had seen enough violence to value peace and enough corruption to appreciate honesty. In the boarding house that attached to the Frontier Inn, Ruthie Bell moved through her daily tasks with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned that invisibility was often the safest course. At 26, she should have been married with children of her own, but circumstance had carved a different path. Her parents had died in the cholera outbreak of 1843, leaving her with nothing but a few possessions and the clothes on her back. The boarding house provided shelter in exchange for cooking, cleaning, and the kind of hard work that left her hands raw and her back aching. Ruthie possessed the kind of beauty that revealed itself slowly, not the obvious prettiness that caught men's eyes across a crowded room, but something deeper that emerged through quiet observation. Her dark hair, usually pinned back severely for work, held auburn highlights that caught the light when she moved. Her eyes, grey as storm clouds, reflected an intelligence that her circumstances hadn't allowed her to fully exercise. She read voraciously when time permitted, borrowing books from Dr. Whitman's small library and returning them with careful questions that revealed a mind hungry for knowledge. The boarding house residents treated her with the casual disregard reserved for furniture present, useful, but hardly worth considering as a person with thoughts and dreams of her own. She served their meals, washed their clothes, and cleaned their rooms while they discussed business, politics, and prospects as if she weren't there. This invisibility had become both protection and prison, shielding her from unwanted attention while slowly eroding her sense of her own worth. Mrs. Adelaide Kowalsski, the boarding house keeper, had taken Ruthie in more from practical necessity than kindness. A widow herself, Mrs. Kowalski understood the precarious position of women without male protection, but her sympathy was tempered by the hard realities of frontier economics. Every mouth to feed had to justify itself through labor, and sentiment didn't pay the bills or stock the pantry. Winter in Cedar Falls brought its own rhythms and challenges. The town contracted into itself, social life reduced to the essential gatherings at Morrison's saloon and the weekly church services led by circuit preacher Matthews when the weather allowed his travel. Conversations turned to survival, whose woodpile would last, which families might need help, how long the preserved food would hold out before spring plantings could provide fresh supplies. The social hierarchy of the small town became more pronounced in winter's forced intimacy. The merchants and professionals occupied the top tier, their stone foundations and well-stocked root cellars providing security that translated into social standing. Below them came the skilled tradesmen, the blacksmith, the carpenter, the harness maker, whose services were essential but seasonal. At the bottom existed people like Ruthie, the unattached women, the drifters waiting for spring, the men whose injuries or age had reduced their prospects to whatever charity the community could spare. It was during these long winter evenings, when the cold pressed conversations toward practical solutions and difficult decisions, that the idea first took shape in the minds of the town council. They gathered in the back room of Holbrook's store, where the warmth from the pot-bellied stove and the privacy from curious ears allowed for the kind of frank discussion that public meetings couldn't accommodate. The mountain man problem had vexed them for years. Jedediah Cain owned legitimate claims to valuable land, but his hermit ways and fierce independence made him unpredictable. He traded his furs and pelts in town just often enough to maintain his legal standing, but he showed no interest in development, partnership, or the kind of progress the town leaders envisioned. His presence represented both an obstacle and an opportunity if only they could find the right leverage. The Ruthie Bell problem was more immediate and, in their minds, more solvable. A single woman of marriageable age with no family connections created social complications in a small community. The boarding house arrangement was temporary at best, and Mrs. Kowalsski had already hinted that a more permanent solution needed to be found. Ruthie's position as a ward of the community's charity sat uneasily with men who believed that every resource should serve a productive purpose. As February deepened into March and the first hints of spring began to stir in the mountain valleys, these two problems began to merge in the minds of Cedar Falls leadership into what they would convince themselves was a solution beneficial to all parties. They could hardly have imagined that their calculated charity would plant the seeds of their own diminished importance, or that the woman they considered a burden would become the cornerstone of a legacy that would outlast their own ambitions. The stage was set for a collision between calculation and genuine need, between society's narrow definitions of worth and the broader possibilities that love and determination could create. In his mountain cabin, Jedediah continued his solitary existence, unaware that his carefully constructed isolation was about to be challenged. In the boarding house, Ruthie carried out her duties, unaware that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. Neither could foresee that their coming together, born of others' schemes, would create something far more valuable than the sum of their separate struggles of partnership that would transform not only their own lives, but the very community that had tried to manipulate them both. The formal document lay on Mayor Holbrook's desk, like a death warrant, its official language masking the cruelty of its intent. Proposal for Territorial Welfare Arrangement. Read the header. Though the men gathered in the store's back room knew it for what it truly was, a calculated disposal of two inconvenient problems. The language is appropriately legal, Councilman Davies said, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles as he reviewed the text. It frames the arrangement as a charitable act designed to benefit all parties involved. Miss Bell receives protection and provision, Mr. Cain receives companionship and domestic assistance, and the territory benefits from the establishment of a proper homestead on valuable land. Mayor Holbrook leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his considerable weight. You've managed to make it sound almost noble, Edgar, though we both know the truth of it. Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably near the stove. Seems to me we're playing God with people's lives. The mountain man never asked for a wife, and the girl certainly never asked to be bartered off like livestock. The girl has no prospects, Davies replied sharply. She's 26, Tom, past her prime and eating charity food while contributing nothing to the community's future. As for Cain, he's been up on that mountain for 7 years without showing any interest in proper development of his holdings. Perhaps a civilizing influence will encourage him to become a more productive member of society. Holbrook nodded slowly. The territorial government has been asking questions about unused land grants. If Cain continues his hermit ways, we might see outside interests stake claims to mineral rights or timber access. Better to have him settled and domesticated than risk losing local control entirely. The truth hung unspoken in the room. They all knew about the geological survey that had identified potential silver deposits in the high country. Cain's land sat directly over what could be the territory's first major mining operation, if they could find a way to access it. A married man with responsibilities might prove more amenable to partnership than a solitary mountain dweller with no ties to the community. Morrison poured himself another cup of coffee, the bitter brew doing little to wash away his distaste for the proceedings. And if the arrangement fails? If she dies up there, or runs off, or he throws her out in the middle of winter, then we'll have tried to help, Davies said with practiced piety. We can hardly be blamed if 2 adults can't make a go of an opportunity freely offered. The community will have discharged its Christian duty. The irony wasn't lost on Morrison that their Christian duty involved no consultation with either of the people whose lives they planned to rearrange. But he'd seen enough frontier politics to know when a decision had already been made. His role was to enforce the law, not to debate the wisdom of those who made it. The proposal was formally presented to both parties on a grey March morning when the last snows still clung to the mountain peaks. Jedediah had come to town for supplies, his quarterly visit that marked the changing seasons and maintained his legal standing as a resident of the territory. He stood in Holbrook's store, his massive frame wrapped in furs and leather, his beard frost touched from the morning ride, examining the document with the slow care of a man who'd learned to read the fine print of life's bitter contracts. "You're offering me a wife," he said finally, his voice carrying the rough edges of disuse. "Like I'd ordered a new rifle or a bag of flour." "We're offering you companionship," Holbrook corrected, though his jovial merchant's smile couldn't quite mask the calculation behind it. "Miss Bell is a good Christian woman who's fallen on hard times. She needs protection and provision. You need someone to tend your home and provide the civilizing influence a man requires. It's a practical arrangement that benefits everyone involved." Jedediah's grey eyes, pale as winter sky, studied the faces of the three men with the intensity he usually reserved for tracking wounded prey. He'd survived 7 years in the mountains by reading signs others missed, and the signs here pointed toward motives none of them would speak aloud. "And what does Miss Bell think of this practical arrangement?" "She's grateful for the opportunity," Davies interjected quickly. "A woman in her position can hardly afford to be particular about prospects." The cruelty of the statement hit Jedediah like a physical blow. He'd known loneliness, known the slow erosion of hope that came from too many empty days, too many conversations with only echoes for company. To reduce another human being's desperation to a matter of convenience seemed to him a particularly refined form of evil. Meanwhile, in the boarding house kitchen, Ruthie Bell received her own version of the proposal from Mrs. Kowalsski, who delivered the news with the brisk efficiency she brought to all unpleasant tasks. "It's a good opportunity," the older woman said, though her tone suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as Ruthie. "Mountain living is hard, but you're strong enough for it. And Mr. Cain, whatever his peculiarities, is known to be honest and capable." Ruthie's hands stilled on the bread dough she'd been kneading. "They want to give me to him, like a piece of furniture they don't need anymore." "Now don't be dramatic, child. It's a marriage arrangement, properly witnessed and legally documented. You'll have protection, provision, and the dignity of being a married woman, instead of dependent on community charity." The word dignity hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire. Ruthie had learned that dignity was a luxury she couldn't afford, that survival often required accepting situations that more fortunate people would find beneath them. But something in her rebelled against the casual dismissal of her own agency in determining her future. "What if I refuse?" Mrs. Kowalski's face hardened. "Then you'll be asked to leave the boarding house. I've carried you through the winter out of Christian charity, but spring's coming and paying guests will need the room. The town council has made it clear that this arrangement represents the limit of community support." The ultimatum was delivered with practiced efficiency, wrapped in enough righteousness to salve Mrs. Kowalski's conscience while making the consequences perfectly clear. Ruthie could accept the mountain man or face the wilderness alone, with nothing but the clothes on her back and whatever wages she'd managed to save from her kitchen work. The meeting between Jedediah and Ruthie took place in Holbrook's store under the watchful eyes of the town's leadership. She stood near the counter in her best dresser, simple grey wool that had seen better years, but was clean and mended with careful stitches. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, emphasizing the sharp planes of her face and the stubborn set of her jaw. Jedediah removed his fur cap when he saw her, revealing hair the color of iron that hung past his shoulders. Up close, she could see that his eyes held intelligence along with wariness, and his hands, though calloused and scarred, moved with surprising gentleness as he set the hat on the counter. "Miss Bell," he said formally, his voice carrying the courtesy his mountain isolation hadn't entirely erased. "Mr. Cain." Her voice was steady, though she clasped her hands to keep them from trembling. They studied each other across the space of the store, while the town council pretended to busy themselves with other matters. Neither spoke of love or even attraction. Such luxuries seemed absurd given the circumstances. Instead, they took the measure of each other like two people assessing the quality of draft animals, looking for signs of strength, endurance, and the ability to pull their share of life's burden. "I won't pretend this is what either of us would have chosen," Jedediah said finally. "But if you're willing to try, I'll do my best to provide for you and treat you with the respect you deserve." Ruthie met his gaze directly. "I won't be a burden, Mr. Cain. I can work, and I can learn what I don't know. I ask only for fairness in return." The bargain was struck with handshakes rather than kisses, witnessed by men who congratulated themselves on solving two problems with one solution. Neither Jedediah nor Ruthie harbored illusions about romance or happiness. They were two damaged people, accepting the terms of a contract that offered survival in exchange for companionship. The ride to the mountain began in silence. Ruthie perched on the supply wagon Jedediah had brought to town, her few possessions in a carpet bag beside her. The trail wound upward through pine forests and granite outcroppings, the air growing thinner and colder with each mile. Behind them, Cedar Falls receded into insignificance, its buildings and people shrinking until they disappeared entirely behind the curve of the mountain. As they climbed higher, the silence between them began to feel less awkward and more companionable. The mountain imposed its own rhythms, its own pace, and both of them seemed to understand instinctively that their arrangement would succeed or fail based on their ability to adapt to something larger than either of their individual needs. When they finally reached the cabin as evening shadows stretched across the clearing, Ruthie stood beside the wagon and surveyed what would now be her home. The structure was solid but sparse, built for function rather than comfort. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and golden light spilled from the single window, creating an island of warmth in the gathering darkness. "It's not much," Jedediah said, suddenly conscious of how primitive his home must appear to someone accustomed to town life. "It's shelter," Ruthie replied simply. "That's more than I had this morning." As he helped her down from the wagon, their hands touched briefly, the first physical contact between two people who would now share their lives, their struggles, and whatever future the mountain would allow them to build together. The patchwork quilt spread across the rough wooden bed like a prayer made manifest in fabric and thread. Each square told us story pieces of her mother's wedding dress, scraps from her father's work shirts, fragments of childhood pinafores that had been outgrown but never forgotten. Ruthie's fingers traced the careful stitches that bound the disparate pieces into something beautiful and whole, the only inheritance she'd brought to her mountain marriage. Her first week in Jedediah's cabin passed like a fever dream of adaptation and discovery. The rhythms of mountain life bore no resemblance to the boarding house routines she'd known. Water had to be hauled from the creek in wooden buckets that left her shoulders aching and her hands raw from the rope handles. Wood needed splitting with an axe that seemed determined to bite everything except the logs she aimed for. The cook stove, fed by wood rather than the coal she was accustomed to, required constant attention to maintain proper heat for baking the bread that had been her specialty in town. Jedediah watched her struggles with the patient attention of a man who understood that competence came through failure as much as success. He offered guidance when asked, but avoided the condescension that would have destroyed her fragile pride. When she misjudged the wood stove's temperament and burned the first batch of biscuits black as charcoal, he ate them without complaint and quietly adjusted the damper to help her understand the stove's moods. "The mountain doesn't forgive mistakes," he told her as they shared a simple supper of beans and salt pork. "But it doesn't punish you for learning either. Every failure teaches you something you need to know for next time." His philosophy of patient persistence began to make sense as she observed his daily routines. Each morning before dawn, he would check the weather signs, the color of the sunrise, the direction of the wind, the behavior of the birds around the cabin. These observations informed every decision about the day's activities. Some mornings called for checking trap lines, others for gathering firewood or mending equipment. The mountain dictated the schedule, not human convenience or preference. Ruthie's introduction to trapping began with disasters that would have been comical if they weren't so frustrating. Her first attempt to set a rabbit snare resulted in a contraption that caught nothing but her own skirt, leaving her suspended by her ankle, while Jedediah carefully extricated her from her own handiwork. Her efforts to skin the rabbits he caught produced mangled pelts that no trader would accept and meat that looked like it had been attacked by a wild animal. "You're thinking too much," Jedediah observed, watching her wrestle with a particularly stubborn rabbit hide. "Your hands know what to do if you let them. Feel for the membrane between skin and muscle. The knife should follow that line, not fight against it." His teaching method relied more on demonstration than explanation. He would show her the proper knife grip, the angle for the initial cut, the smooth motion that separated hide from carcass with minimal waste. Then he would hand her the knife and step back, letting her fingers learn what her mind was trying too hard to control. The breakthrough came during her second week, when a late spring blizzard trapped them both in the cabin for 3 days. With nothing but time and Jedediah's patient instruction, she finally managed to skin and clean a rabbit properly, producing meat fit for the stew pot and a hide that might actually be worth something when dried and prepared. "There," Jedediah said with quiet satisfaction as she held up the intact pelt. "Now you're starting to understand." But it wasn't just the practical skills that marked her progress. The conversations that developed during their evening meals revealed depths in both of them that their circumstances had forced them to hide. Jedediah, despite his years of isolation, retained a curious intelligence and a dry humor that emerged when he felt safe enough to let his guard down. He spoke of books he'd read during the long winter nights, of philosophical questions that had occupied his thoughts during solitary hours, of observations about nature that revealed a mind trained to find patterns and meaning in the wilderness. Ruthie discovered that her own hunger for knowledge, long suppressed by the practical demands of survival, could find expression in their discussions. She asked questions about the plants and animals they encountered, about the geological formations that shaped their mountain home, about the weather patterns that determined so much of their daily existence. Jedediah's answers often led to broader conversations about the world beyond their isolated valley, about the changes sweeping across the Western Territories, about their own hopes and fears for the future. The physical spaces they shared gradually became more comfortable as well. The cabin's single room had initially felt impossibly intimate for two strangers, but familiarity bred a kind of peaceful coexistence. They developed unspoken protocols about privacy and personal space, small courtesies that acknowledged their mutual humanity while respecting the boundaries their arrangement required. Ruthie established her own corner near the window, where she could spread her quilt and work on the mending that seemed to multiply like rabbits in a hutch. The morning light there was good for the close work of repairing tears in Jedediah's work clothes and reinforcing the seams that took the hardest wear. Her sewing kit, brought from town, proved invaluable for maintaining the gear that kept them alive and functional. The quilt itself became a bridge between her old life and her new one. In the evenings, when the day's work was done and they sat by the fire, she would sometimes tell him the stories behind the fabric, squares the blue calico from her mother's favorite Sunday dress, the red wool from a coat her father had worn to town meetings, the yellow cotton from her own first attempt at making a grown-up dress when she turned 16. "Every family should have something that tells its story," Jedediah said one evening, watching her careful stitches as she reinforced a corner that was beginning to fray. "Something that connects the past to the present." "What tells your story?" she asked, looking around the cabin that held so few personal items. He was quiet for a long moment, then rose and retrieved his trapping journal from the shelf. "This, I suppose, 7 years of weather and wildlife, of seasons and solitude. Not much of a legacy, but it's honest work." She took the journal when he offered it, turning the pages carefully and reading entries that chronicled a life of careful observation and quiet endurance. The entries were spare, factual, but between the lines she could read the loneliness of a man who had chosen isolation over the pain of human connection. "It's more than a record," she said finally. "It's proof that you survived, that you didn't give up when things got hard." Their growing understanding was tested on a morning when Ruthie decided to check the nearby trap lines alone, thinking to surprise Jedediah with her independence and competence. The morning had dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made distances deceptive and directions uncertain. She followed what she thought was the familiar path to the creek where several snares were set. But the spring melt had changed the landscape, creating new channels and washing out old landmarks. By midday, she realized she was lost. The panic that seized her was unlike anything she'd experienced. Not the familiar worry about money or social position, but the primal terror of being alone and vulnerable in a wilderness that could kill her through simple indifference. Every tree began to look the same. Every ridge led to another identical ridge, and the sun that should have guided her home seemed to move in circles overhead. She tried to retrace her steps, but her tracks in the soft earth only confused her further. The temperature was dropping as afternoon shadows lengthened, and she had no heavy coat, no food, no way to make fire if she had to spend the night outdoors. The mountain that had begun to feel like home now revealed itself as the alien, dangerous place it had always been. Jedediah found her just as full darkness fell, following her trail with the patience of a man who understood that haste in the wilderness led to disaster. She was huddled against a fallen log, shivering violently and fighting back tears of frustration and terror. When his lantern light found her, the relief on both their faces spoke volumes about how much they had come to mean to each other. "I thought I knew the way," she said through chattering teeth as he wrapped his heavy coat around her shoulders. "The mountain changes," he replied simply. "Snow melts, streams change course, new deadfalls block old paths. Even I get turned around sometimes after a hard winter." But as he guided her home through the darkness, his hand steady on her elbow, and his voice calm with directions and encouragement, she understood that his fear for her safety had been as real as her own terror. They were no longer just two people sharing a cabin out of necessity. They had become partners in the truest sense, each responsible for the other's welfare and survival. The quilt felt different that night as she pulled it over herself in the narrow bed they still did not share. The patches of fabric that had once represented only the past now seemed to include the possibility of a future where her story and Jedediah's might weave together into something larger and more beautiful than either could. Create alone. The wooden spoons lay side by side on the cabin's rough table, their smooth surfaces glowing golden in the lamplight. Jedediah had carved them during the long evening hours when Ruthie worked on her mending, his knife moving with practiced precision through the close-grained maple he'd selected from a windfall near the creek. Each spoon bore subtle differences own, with a deeper bowl for soups, another with a longer handle for stirring, a third sized perfectly for Ruthie's smaller hands. "You made these for me," she said, running her fingers over the satiny finish that spoke of patient hours spent with sandstone and careful oil treatments. "We needed proper utensils." Jedediah replied, though his gruff tone couldn't entirely mask the pleasure her appreciation brought him. "Can't expect to build a proper home with nothing but my old camping gear." Spring had arrived, with the sudden intensity that characterized mountain seasons. Some day the world lay locked in winter's grip. The next, the creek ran full with snowmelt, and green shoots pushed through the forest floor. The transformation seemed to mirror the changes occurring between the cabin's two inhabitants, as if the warming earth had thawed something frozen in both their hearts. Ruthie's competence in mountain life had grown along with her confidence. The trap lines that had once seemed like random arrangements of wire and wood now made perfect sense to her eye. She could read the subtle signs that indicated where rabbits habitually traveled, where deer came to drink, where the paths of predator and prey intersected in the ancient dance of survival. Her skinning technique had improved to the point where Jedediah no longer needed to check her work, and the pelts she prepared would bring fair prices when trading time came to town. More importantly, she had begun to anticipate the rhythms of their shared life. She woke now before Jedediah's alarm, stoking the fire and preparing coffee so that warmth and caffeine waited for him when he rose to check the weather signs. She learned to read his moods and needs when he returned from trap lines, with the careful movements that spoke of old injuries protesting cold weather. She would have hot water ready for washing and liniment, prepared for the aches he never mentioned aloud. Their first real argument came on a morning when Jedediah discovered that Ruthie had reset several of his traps, moving them to locations she judged more promising based on fresh signs she'd observed. His initial reaction was swift and sharp. These were his trap lines, maintained through years of careful observation, and her interference could cost them valuable pelts and scarce resources. "You can't just change everything because you think you see a better way," he said, his voice carrying an edge of the authority he'd wielded during his solitary years. "These sets have produced consistently for 3 seasons. And they would produce better if moved 20 yards upstream where the fresh trails show the rabbits are actually traveling now," Ruthie replied, her own stubbornness rising to match his. "I've been watching for a week, and the old paths are barely used anymore." The standoff might have escalated into something damaging if not for Jedediah's recognition that her observations were not only accurate, but demonstrated a growing mastery of skills he'd been trying to teach her. The rabbit runs had indeed shifted with the spring melt, creating new travel patterns that his established trap locations no longer intercepted effectively. "Show me what you've seen," he said finally, setting aside his injured pride in favor of practical results. They spent the morning walking the trap lines together, with Ruthie pointing out the subtle signs that had led to her conclusions, fresher droppings along certain paths, new scrapes where animals had passed through underbrush, the wear patterns on fallen logs that served as natural bridges across the swollen creek. Her eye had learned to read the mountain's story as clearly as his own, and her suggestions for trap relocation proved both sound and productive. "I should have listened first instead of reacting," Jedediah admitted as they walked home with 3 rabbits that had been caught in Ruthie's relocated snares. Partnership means trusting each other's observations, not just following old habits. The resolution of their conflict marked a turning point in their relationship. They were no longer teacher and student, protector and protected, but genuine partners whose combined skills and knowledge made them more effective than either could be alone. The evening conversations that had begun as polite exchanges of information deepened into genuine intimacy as they shared not just daily observations, but deeper thoughts about their hopes and fears. It was during one of these conversations, as they sat on the cabin's small porch, watching the last light fade behind the western peaks, that Ruthie finally spoke about the loneliness that had driven her to accept the town council's arrangement. "I used to think the worst thing about being poor was not having enough to eat," she said, her voice barely audible above the evening sounds of the mountain. "But it wasn't the hunger that nearly broke me, it was the invisibility, being in rooms full of people and knowing that none of them saw you as anything more than furniture." Jedediah's own confession came slowly, drawn out by her honesty and the growing trust between them. "I came to the mountains to escape people who couldn't see past what I'd lost in the war. They looked at me and saw either a hero to be celebrated or a broken thing to be pitied. Neither one was who I actually was." "What did you lose?" she asked gently. "My unit, 23 men who trusted me to bring them home." His voice carried the weight of years spent carrying that burden alone. "I made a choice that saved the mission but cost them their lives. The army called it heroic. I called it the worst failure of my life." She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, her work-roughened fingers intertwining with his. "You've been punishing yourself ever since." "Maybe. Or maybe I just finally found the only place where that kind of failure couldn't follow me." "It followed you," she said with quiet conviction. "But it doesn't have to define what comes next." The physical intimacy that had been growing between them throughout the spring finally found expression that night. Not in passionate abandon, they were both too wounded and careful for that, but in the gentle exploration of 2 people, learning to trust not just each other's competence, but each other's hearts. They came together like their own lives had been coming together, carefully and gradually, building something solid rather than dramatic. Afterward, as they lay together in the narrow bed that had once seemed impossibly intimate for strangers, Ruthie traced the scars that marked Jedediah's chest and arms, with fingers that spoke of acceptance rather than pity. "Every mark tells a story," she murmured, "like the squares in my quilt. Most of them are stories I'd rather forget." "Maybe, but they're part of what brought you here, to this mountain, to this moment. Would you change that if you could?" He was quiet for a long time, considering not just her question, but the profound shift it represented. For 7 years, he had wished daily that he could undo the choices that had led to his exile. Now, with her warm presence beside him and the promise of a shared future spreading before them like an unexplored territory, the past seemed less like a prison and more like a map that had guided him to exactly where he needed to be. The news from town, when it came with the supply run of a traveling trader, seemed to belong to a different world entirely. The same men who had engineered their arrangement were still playing their political games, still maneuvering for advantage and profit, while missing the real changes occurring in their territory. The trader spoke of mining surveys and railroad speculation, of Eastern investors looking for opportunities in the mountain territories, of the growing pressure on independent landowners to either develop their holdings or lose them to more aggressive interests. "Seems your land's attracting attention," the trader told Jedediah as they conducted their business outside the cabin. "Fellow came through Cedar Falls last month asking specifically about mineral rights up in these ranges. Town council seemed mighty interested in what he had to say." Jedediah and Ruthie exchanged glances that spoke of shared understanding. The arrangement that had brought them together might have been motivated by factors neither of them had fully comprehended at the time. But whatever schemes had been brewing in the minds of Cedar Falls leadership, they had created something far more valuable than any mineral depositor partnership strong enough to face whatever challenges the future might bring. As summer settled over their mountain home, their daily routines took on the comfortable rhythm of a well-established marriage. Ruthie's garden, planted with seeds she'd carefully hoarded through the winter, promised vegetables that would supplement their diet and reduce their dependence on expensive supplies from town. Jedediah's trap lines, now managed jointly with input from both partners, produced consistently better results than his solitary efforts had achieved. The wooden spoons that had marked his first conscious effort to build a shared life, rather than merely share space, had been joined by other small improvement shelves for Ruthie's growing collection of preserved foods, a proper washstand that made their morning routines more civilized, additional furniture that acknowledged their home as a permanent dwelling rather than a temporary shelter. But the most significant change was less tangible, the sense that they were building something that would outlast both of them, a legacy that would justify the struggles and losses that had brought them together. The mountain that had once been Jedediah's refuge from human connection had become the foundation for the deepest relationship either of them had ever known. The cradle sat half-finished in the corner of the cabin, its hand-hewn pine boards glowing honey-gold in the lamplight. Jedediah worked on it during the evening hours, his knife moving with reverent precision as he shaped the rockers that would someday soothe his child to sleep. Each piece had been selected with carrick-knot-free wood that would hold together under years of use, grain patterns that would be beautiful as well as functional, joints fitted so perfectly that no nails or screws would be needed to hold the structure together. "You're sure?" he had asked when Ruthie first shared her suspicions, his weathered hands gentle on her shoulders, as if she might break under the weight of his hope. "As sure as I can be without Doc Henderson's confirmation," she had replied, placing his palm against her still flat belly where their child grew. "My courses stopped 6 weeks ago, and I've been sick every morning for the past 2 weeks. Mama always said those were the signs that didn't lie." The joy that had transformed Jedediah's face made her understand why some women spent their whole lives trying to give men children. Not from submission or duty, but from the profound satisfaction of creating something so wanted, so cherished, that its mere possibility could light up a face that had known too much sorrow. Their first trip to town as a married couple took place on a crisp October morning when the aspens blazed gold against the evergreen slopes and the air carried the sharp promise of winter. Ruthie sat beside Jedediah on the wagon seat, her growing belly barely visible beneath her wool coat, but undeniably present to her own awareness. The child their child had become the invisible third party in every conversation, every plan, every decision about their future. Cedar Falls looked smaller than she remembered, its buildings more weathered, its streets more rutted by the passage of supply wagons and livestock. The curious stares that followed their arrival spoke of the town's keen interest in the success or failure of the arrangement they had engineered. Some faces showed genuine surprise at Ruthie's obvious health and contentment. Clearly, the betting had favored a very different outcome. Mayor Holbrook's greeting carried forced heartiness that fooled no one. "Jedediah and Mrs. Cain, how well you look. Mountain life seems to agree with you both." "It does indeed," Ruthie replied with quiet dignity, accepting the title that still felt new on her tongue. She had learned from Jedediah the value of saying little while observing much, and the undercurrents of tension in the town's leadership were as visible to her as animal tracks in fresh snow. Dr. Sarah Henderson's arrival in Cedar Falls had occurred during their summer isolation, and Ruthie's first meeting with the territory's only female physician proved to be one of the most significant encounters of her pregnancy. Dr. Henderson was a compact woman in her 40s, with steel-grey hair pinned severely back and intelligent eyes that missed nothing of medical significance. She had trained in Philadelphia before following her late husband west, and her competence had quickly overcome the initial skepticism of frontier men who thought healing was women's work until they needed serious medical attention. "Your first child?" Dr. Henderson asked, as she conducted her examination in the small office behind the Territorial courthouse. "Yes, ma'am. I'm near 4 months along, I believe. A good, strong heartbeat, and you're carrying well. The mountain air and physical work have kept you healthy. I see too many town women who think pregnancy requires taking to their beds like invalid ladies." Dr. Henderson's matter-of-fact manner put Ruthie at ease in a way that feminine sympathy never could have. "You'll need to come down for the birth, though. I won't risk a first delivery that far from proper assistance." The practical arrangements for the birth led to discussions that revealed the growing network of relationships Ruthie had never expected to develop. Mrs. Kowalsski, her former employer, offered the boarding house as a lying-in-place gesture of reconciliation that acknowledged Ruthie's transformation from charity case to respected community member. Other women, wives of merchants and tradesmen who had barely acknowledged her existence during her years of service, now sought her advice about mountain remedies and preservation techniques that could benefit their own households. "It's funny how becoming a wife changed how people see me," Ruthie observed to Jedediah as they prepared to return to the mountain. "Same person, same skills, but now I'm worth talking to. Marriage gives you a place in their social order," he replied. "Before, you were outside their understanding of how the world should work. Now you fit into a category they recognize and respect." The winter preparations took on new urgency with a child coming. The cabin that had seemed adequate for 2 adults would need modifications to accommodate a family. Jedediah began planning an addition that would provide separate sleeping space and additional storage for the supplies a baby would require. The root cellar, already well stocked with Ruthie's preserved vegetables and canned goods, received additional provisions that would see them through not just the winter, but the vulnerable weeks after the birth, when travel to town might be impossible. Ruthie's body adapted to pregnancy with the same competence she had brought to learning mountain life. The morning sickness that had plagued her early months gave way to robust health and seemingly boundless energy. She continued checking trap lines well into her 6th month, her growing belly balanced by her improved strength and confidence. The physical changes fascinated Jedediah, who watched her transformation with the wonder of a man who had never been close enough to a pregnant woman to observe the daily miracle of life, creating life. "The baby moves now," she told him one evening as they sat by the fire, his hand spread across her belly where small kicks and turns created visible movements beneath her skin. "Strong little thing takes after its father already." The community of women that formed around Ruthie's pregnancy surprised her with its warmth and practical support. Women who had barely spoken to her during her boarding house years now stopped by during her town visits to share advice, remedies, and the kind of folklore that passed from mother to daughter across generations. Mrs. Davies, the councilman's sister-in-law, brought patterns for baby clothes and offered to teach Ruthie the fine needlework that would create garments worthy of a mountain family's first child. "Every baby born in this territory makes us all stronger," the older woman explained as she demonstrated the delicate stitches that would make infant clothes both beautiful and durable. "Your child will grow up here, marry here, raise children here. That makes your family's success our community's success." The shift in perspective was profound but not entirely welcome. Ruthie understood that her acceptance came partly from her pregnancy proof that the arrangement had worked as intended, that she was fulfilling her designated role in the community's future. But she also recognized genuine warmth from women who had come to respect her transformation from dependent to partner, from burden to asset. The most meaningful relationship that developed was with Dr. Henderson, who appreciated Ruthie's intelligent questions and practical approach to pregnancy and childbirth. During her monthly visits to town for examinations, Ruthie learned not just about her own condition, but about the broader challenges of bringing children safely into the world on the frontier. "You have advantages many women lack," Dr. Henderson observed during one visit. "Good nutrition, physical strength, and a husband who supports rather than burdens you. But mountain winters can be dangerous for new mothers and infants. We need to plan carefully for your confinement." The plan that emerged involved Ruthie coming to town for the final weeks of her pregnancy, staying at the boarding house where Dr. Henderson could monitor her condition and respond quickly when labor began. Jedediah would accompany her, setting up temporary residence in town to be present for the birth and the vulnerable early weeks of their child's life. "I don't like leaving the mountain unprotected that long," Jedediah admitted as they discussed the arrangements. 7 years I've never been away from the trap lines during prime season." "The traps can wait," Ruthie replied firmly. "This baby is more important than any pelts we might lose." Her certainty reflected not just maternal instinct, but a deeper understanding of what their child represented. This baby would be the first generation of Cains born on the mountain, the beginning of a legacy that would justify all their struggles and sacrifices. The child would inherit not just land and resources, but a way of life that honored both independence and community, strength and compassion. The cradle neared completion as winter settled over their home. Jedediah had carved simple decorations into the headboard, pine boughs and mountain flowers that would remind their child of the landscape that had shaped its parents' love. The rockers moved with perfect balance, creating the gentle motion that would soothe fussy nights and afternoon naps. Inside, Ruthie had placed her mother's quilt, the patchwork squares now taking on new meaning as they prepared to shelter another generation. "Perfect timing," she observed, watching Jedediah apply the final coat of beeswax that would protect the wood from moisture and give it a warm glow. "Finished just as the baby's room is ready to receive it." The addition to the cabin had taken shape throughout the fall, with Jedediah working during every spare moment to enclose and finish the space that would serve as both nursery and expanded bedroom. The new room doubled their living space and provided the privacy that a growing family would need. A window faced east, ensuring that morning light would wake the baby gently, while thick walls and careful chinking would keep winter cold at bay. As her time approached, Ruthie found herself studying Jedediah with new eyes, trying to imagine him as a father. His gentleness with her during pregnancy suggested that he would bring the same patient teaching to child rearing that he had shown in helping her adapt to mountain life. But she also wondered how fatherhood would change a man who had spent 7 years learning to live without the emotional vulnerabilities that children inevitably created. "Are you frightened?" she asked him one evening, as they felt the baby's strong kicks against her ribs. "Terrified," he admitted without hesitation. "I know how to keep you safe up here, how to provide for us both. But a baby that's completely different. Everything I know about protection and provision has to be learned all over again." "We'll learn together," she assured him, covering his hand with hers. "Same as we learned everything else about being married, being partners." But even as she offered comfort, Ruthie felt her own fears about the approaching birth. The mountain that had become her sanctuary would not be able to help her through the trial of labor and delivery. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, she would have to trust her life to other people's competence, other people's care. The independence she had fought so hard to achieve would temporarily give way to the universal vulnerability of women bringing children into the world. The first snow arrived early that year, dusting the peaks in October and settling into the valleys by November. The early onset of winter compressed their remaining time on the mountain and accelerated the preparations for their temporary relocation to town. Every decision had to be weighed against the welfare of their unborn child, consideration that transformed even routine choices into matters of life and death importance. As they packed for the journey that would take them away from their mountain home until spring, the Cradle sat ready in the wagon bed, cushioned with quilts and surrounded by the other necessities of frontier childbirth. The sight of it there, so small and hopeful amid the practical supplies, made their approaching parenthood feel suddenly real and urgent. Soon that carefully crafted bed would hold their child, the first fruit of a love that had begun in others' scheming, but had grown into something neither of them could have imagined when they first shook hands in Holbrook's store. The rifle hung above the fireplace like a benediction from the past, its walnut stock polished smooth by generations of Cain hands. Jedediah's grandfather had carried it through the Indian Wars. His father had used it to hunt the game that fed their Missouri farm. And now it would pass to another generation, a symbol of protection, provision, and the continuity that bound families across time and distance. Samuel Aaron Cain entered the world during the worst blizzard in 20 years, his birth cry mixing with the howl of wind that rattled the boarding house windows and piled snow against the doors. Dr. Henderson worked by lamplight, while Jedediah paced the hallway outside, his mountaineer's calm shattered by the sounds of his wife's labor and his own helplessness in the face of forces beyond his control. "A son," Dr. Henderson announced as she emerged from the birthing room, her sleeves rolled up and her face showing the satisfaction of a difficult job completed successfully. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and lungs strong enough to wake the whole territory. The baby was perfecta wrinkled, red-faced miracle that seemed impossibly small in Jedediah's large hands. Samuel's eyes, when they opened, held the same grey intensity as his father's, and his grip on Jedediah's finger spoke of the strength that would be needed for mountain life. Ruthie, exhausted but triumphant, watched her husband's face transform as he held their son for the first time. "He looks like you," she whispered, though in truth the baby looked like all newborn sentient and wise and utterly vulnerable. "He looks like himself," Jedediah replied, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't known he could still feel, "like the future we're going to build for him." The early weeks with Samuel taught them both that parenthood was like everything else about mountain life, harder than expected, but more rewarding than they could have imagined. The baby thrived on mountain air and his mother's milk, growing sturdy and alert, with the rapid development that seemed to characterize children born to frontier life. His sleep schedule gradually aligned with the rhythms of mountain living, as if he instinctively understood that survival required adaptation to the natural world rather than resistance against it. Jedediah's transformation into fatherhood amazed Ruthie with its completeness. The man who had spent 7 years avoiding human connection now devoted himself to his son's welfare with the same intensity he had once brought to solitary survival. He crafted toys from carved wood and soft leather, sang half-remembered lullabies in a voice made rusty by years of disuse, and spent hours simply watching Samuel sleep as if the sight could never grow old. "You're going to spoil him," Ruthie observed, watching Jedediah fashion a miniature bow from flexible willow branches. "Can't spoil a child with love and attention," he replied, testing the bow's flexibility. "Might spoil him with softness, but not with caring." The distinction proved important as Samuel grew from infant to toddler to boy. Jedediah's love was abundant, but never indulgent, his teaching patient, but never permissive. By the time Samuel could walk, he was learning to read tracks in the snow, to identify edible plants, to move quietly through the forest, without disturbing the wildlife that provided their livelihood. The lessons came through play and stories rather than formal instruction, but they were no less thorough for being enjoyable. Jacob William Cain arrived 2 years later during a spring thaw that turned the mountain trails into rivers of mud and made travel to town impossible. Dr. Henderson had prepared Ruthie for the possibility of delivering without medical assistance, and this time the birth proceeded with the efficiency of a body that knew its business. Jedediah served as midwife, his steady hands and calm presence guiding his second son into the world with the same competence he brought to every mountain crisis. Bigger than Samuel was, Ruthie observed, cradling the newest addition to their family. And louder if that's possible. Jacob's personality declared itself early and forcefully. Where Samuel had been a contemplative baby, content to observe the world with serious grey eyes, Jacob demanded constant interaction with his environment. He crawled earlier, walked sooner, and showed an eagerness for physical challenges that promised future adventures and probable injuries. His hair grew in dark and thick like his mother's, but his temperament clearly favoured his father's direct approach to problem-solving. The dynamics of family life shifted with the addition of a second child. Samuel, no longer the exclusive focus of adult attention, initially resented his brother's arrival, but gradually came to see Jacob as a potential playmate and partner in exploration. The brothers developed the kind of relationship that frontier children needed: competitive but loyal, independent but mutually protective. Ruthie found herself managing not just a household but a small community, with each family member requiring different types of attention and guidance. Samuel's careful nature made him easy to teach, but sometimes difficult to motivate, while Jacob's enthusiasm made him eager to learn but prone to dangerous experimentation. Balancing their different needs while maintaining the routines that kept their mountain household functioning required skills she was still developing. The challenges multiplied when threats from outside their mountain sanctuary began to intrude on their family peace. Claim jumpers had been reported throughout the territory, men who identified valuable but isolated properties and used violence or legal manipulation to seize them from their rightful owners. The Cain family's obvious prosperity, their expanded cabin, well-stocked root cellar, and growing herd of livestock made them an attractive target for those who preferred theft to honest work. "We need to be more careful," Jedediah told Ruthie after a disturbing encounter with strangers who had claimed to be lost hunters, but who showed more interest in their property than in finding their way. "Men like that don't just wander through this country by accident." The rifle above the fireplace, which had been primarily symbolic during their early years together, now took on practical significance. Jedediah began teaching Samuel the basics of firearms safety and marksmanship, skills that mountain children needed as much for hunting as for protection. The lessons were serious, but not frightening part of the comprehensive education that would prepare Samuel to defend his family and their land. Jacob's birth had been followed 18 months later by the arrival of Ezra Thomas Cain, whose entry into the world coincided with the first serious attempt by outsiders to challenge the family's land claims. A group of Eastern investors, backed by territorial politicians hungry for development money, had begun filing legal papers that questioned the validity of isolated homestead claims. Their strategy was simple: create enough legal uncertainty to force small landowners into expensive court battles they couldn't afford to fight. "They're not interested in justice," Sheriff Morrison explained during a visit to warn the Cains about the developing situation. "They're counting on most folks giving up rather than fighting a legal battle that could drag on for years." But the Cain family's response defied the investors' expectations. Jedediah had meticulously maintained all documentation related to his land claims, and 7 years of continuous improvement had created an unassailable legal position. More importantly, his marriage to Ruthie and the establishment of their family had transformed him from a hermit into a respected community member, with allies willing to support his rights. Ezra's personality emerged as distinctly different from his older brothers. Where Samuel was thoughtful and Jacob was energetic, Ezra displayed an early talent for understanding people and situations. Even as a toddler, he showed an uncanny ability to sense adult moods and respond appropriately. His smile could diffuse tension. His questions revealed genuine interest in others' thoughts and feelings, and his natural diplomacy suggested future leadership qualities. "That one's going to be trouble," Ruthie observed, watching 2-year-old Ezra charm a supply trader into giving him an extra piece of candy through pure force of personality. "Good trouble," Jedediah replied, "the kind that gets things done without making enemies." The family's reputation in Cedar Falls had undergone a complete transformation since the days when the town council had orchestrated their marriage as a cruel joke. The Cain name now carried weight in territorial politics. Their opinion was sought on matters affecting mountain development, and their success story was cited as evidence of what could be accomplished when people were given proper support and opportunity. The three boys represented different aspects of their parents' legacy. Samuel inherited his father's careful observation skills and his mother's quiet determination. Jacob embodied the physical courage and direct action that mountain life demanded. Ezra combined his mother's intelligence with his father's natural authority, creating a personality that could bridge different worlds and bring conflicting parties together. As the boys grew, they began to participate in the adult work that sustained their family. Samuel proved naturally gifted at tracking and trapping, his patient nature perfectly suited to the long waits and careful observations that successful hunting required. Jacob's strength and enthusiasm made him invaluable for the physical labor of expanding their homestead and maintaining their livestock. Ezra's people skills made him the natural choice for trips to town and negotiations with traders and suppliers. The rifle that had welcomed Samuel into the world now watched over 3 sons who would inherit not just their grandfather's weapon, but the responsibility to protect and provide for future generations. Each boy would learn to handle firearms with respect and competence, understanding that weapons were tools for feeding their family and defending their home rather than instruments of aggression or intimidation. The legacy that Jedediah and Ruthie were building extended beyond their own children to the broader community that had grown up around their mountain home. Other families, inspired by the Cain's success, had established homesteads in the surrounding valleys. An informal network of mutual support had developed, with neighbors sharing labor during harvest time, pooling resources for major projects, and providing assistance during emergencies. The transformation was complete what had begun, as a desperate arrangement between 2 discarded people had grown into the foundation of a thriving mountain community. The same forces that had tried to manipulate them for narrow advantage now had to reckon with a family whose success had made them too valuable to dismiss and too strong to intimidate. The surveyor's map spread across Mayor Holbrook's desk like a treasure chart from a pirate story, its precise lines and technical notations revealing secrets that had been hidden beneath the mountain's surface for millennia. Red ink marked the mineral deposits that geological surveys had confirmed over the past month, silver veins that ran directly through the heart of Jedediah Cain's homestead claim. Deposits rich enough to transform Cedar Falls from a struggling frontier town into a major mining center. "Estimated value?" Councilman Davies asked, adjusting his spectacles to better examine the technical drawings. "Conservative estimate, $12 million, replied Harrison Blackwood, the mining company representative whose eastern suit and soft hands marked him as clearly as a brand. "Liberal estimate, closer to 20 million. Either way, gentlemen, we're looking at the kind of wealth that could make this territory a state within 5 years. The 3 men studied the map in silence, each calculating what such wealth could mean for their own fortunes and positions. Holbrook saw paved streets, gas lighting, and the kind of commercial development that would make him rich beyond his current merchant dreams. Davies envisioned political opportunities that stretched far beyond Cedar Falls Territorial legislature, perhaps even Congress when statehood came. Even Sheriff Morrison, despite his reservations about the methods being discussed, couldn't entirely suppress thoughts of what proper law enforcement funding could accomplish. "The problem remains the same," Blackwood continued, rolling up the map with the careful precision of a man handling valuable documents. "Your mountain hermit shows no interest in development partnerships, and his legal claim to the land is unassailable. 7 years of continuous improvement, a thriving family, detailed documentation any court in the territory would uphold his ownership rights." Davies leaned back in his chair, a thin smile playing across his angular features. "Perhaps it's time to reveal the full scope of our original arrangement with Mr. Cain." The revelation that followed would have staggered Jedediah and Ruthie with its calculated cynicism. The town council's decision to pair them had never been the charitable gesture they had presented to the community. Geological surveys conducted 2 years before their marriage had already identified the mineral potential of Cain's land, and the council's plan had been predicated on the assumption that Ruthie Bell would fail to survive mountain life, leaving Jedediah isolated and vulnerable to pressure or manipulation. The woman was supposed to be gone within 6 months, Davies admitted with the matter-of-fact tone he might use to discuss crop failures or livestock prices. Frozen, fled, or simply unable to adapt to the hardships, Cain would have been left more isolated than ever, probably grateful for any offer of partnership that brought him human contact. Instead, she thrived, Holbrook observed with grudging admiration. Not only survived, but made that mountain operation more profitable than Cain ever managed alone. 3 healthy sons, expanded buildings, livestock, improved crop yields. They've built something that any family would be proud to claim. Blackwood's expression revealed nothing of his thoughts about the moral implications of their original scheme. Mining companies dealt with land acquisition as a purely business matter, and the personal stories of displaced families were rarely considered beyond their impact on profit margins and development schedules. "Sentiment doesn't extract silver from mountain rock," he said finally. "We need that land, gentlemen, and we need it before competing interests become aware of its value. The Northern Pacific Railroad is surveying routes through this territory, and mineral-rich areas will command premium prices for transportation access." The pressure tactics began subtly, as they always did in such situations. Traders who had previously offered fair prices for Cain family furs and agricultural products suddenly found their offers reduced by half. Supply deliveries that had always been reliable began experiencing mysterious delays. Credit that had been freely extended for 7 years was quietly tightened, making routine purchases more difficult and expensive. Jedediah noticed the changes immediately, his mountain-honed instincts alert to any shift in established patterns. "Something's happening in town," he told Ruthie after a particularly frustrating trading session. "Holbrook barely looked me in the eye, and Davies acted like I owed him money instead of the other way around." The truth began to emerge through Dr. Henderson, whose position as the territory's only female physician gave her access to information that other women might not receive. Her friendship with Ruthie had deepened over the years, and her respect for the Cain family's achievements made her willing to risk social standing to warn them of developing threats. "There's mining company money flowing through town," she told Ruthie during a private conversation at the boarding house. "Eastern investors with more capital than conscience, and they're asking specific questions about your family's land holdings." The full scope of the conspiracy became clear when Samuel, now 12 years old, and trusted with increasingly important responsibilities, overheard a conversation between Mayor Holbrook and Councilman Davies while delivering supplies to the general store. The boy's sharp intelligence and his father's training in careful observation allowed him to understand the significance of what he heard: references to the original plan, discussions of acceptable losses, and calculations about forcing a more reasonable position. "They never expected Mama to survive," Samuel told his parents that evening, his young face serious with the weight of adult knowledge. "They thought she'd die or run away, and then they could pressure you into selling the land for whatever they wanted to pay." The betrayal cut deeper than any of them had expected. Ruthie, who had finally found acceptance and respect in the community, now understood that her marriage had been engineered by men who had callously calculated her probable death. Jedediah, who had come to value his family's place in the Territorial community, realized that their neighbors' regard was conditional on their usefulness to other people's ambitions. But the revelation also clarified their situation in ways that strengthened rather than weakened their resolve. The same forces that had tried to manipulate them into a convenient arrangement had inadvertently created something far more valuable than Silver Depositza family, united by genuine love and tested by shared struggles, a partnership that had transformed two broken individuals into formidable allies. "Let them come," Jedediah said, taking down his grandfather's rifle and beginning the methodical process of cleaning and checking its mechanism. "This land belongs to our family now, legally and morally. They want it. They'll have to take it by force." Ruthie's response surprised him with its strategic sophistication. Her years of invisibility in the boarding house had taught her to observe human nature carefully, and her understanding of the forces arrayed against them included insights that Jedediah's more direct personality might have missed. "Force won't be their first choice," she observed. "Too risky, too likely to bring territorial government attention they don't want. They'll try legal challenges first, then economic pressure, then social isolation. Only, if all that fails, will they resort to outright violence." Her assessment proved accurate as the mining company's campaign intensified throughout the following months. Legal papers appeared challenging various aspects of the Cain family's land claims, requiring expensive responses from attorneys who had to be brought in from distant cities. Economic pressure increased as more businesses in Cedar Falls began refusing to deal with the family, forcing them to seek supplies and markets in communities 50 miles away. Social pressure mounted as long-time neighbors grew distant, unwilling to risk their own positions by associating with people who had become inconvenient to powerful interests. But the mining company's representatives had underestimated both the Cain family's resources and their connections within the broader territorial community. Jedediah's careful documentation of his land improvements, maintained religiously for 7 years, provided unassailable legal evidence of his claims. Ruthie's reputation among the network of frontier women created allies who were willing to provide support and information despite social pressure to abandon the family. Most importantly, their 3 sons represented a new generation of mountain residents whose loyalty to their family was absolute and whose skills were already formidable enough to make violent solutions extremely costly. The final confrontation was precipitated by the mining company's decision to bring in hired gunmen whose reputations for violence were supposed to intimidate the Cain family into accepting whatever settlement was offered. But the arrival of obvious mercenaries in Cedar Falls had the opposite effect, alerting the territorial authorities to the situation and galvanizing community members who might have remained neutral in a purely business dispute. Sheriff Morrison found himself in an impossible position, torn between his duty to maintain law and order and the political pressure being exerted by men who had the power to end his career. His solution was to visit the Cain homestead personally, ostensibly to warn them about the developing situation, but actually to assess their readiness for the conflict that everyone now recognized as inevitable. "You've got legal right on your side," he told Jedediah as they stood on the cabin's porch, looking out over the land that had become the center of so much controversy. "But legal right doesn't stop bullets, and there's men in town now who've killed for a lot less than $20 million worth of silver. Then they'd better be prepared to die for it too," Jedediah replied, his quiet tone carrying more menace than any shouted threat. "This is our home, Tom, our children's inheritance. We won't be driven off by men who think money gives them the right to steal what other people have built." The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of one family, but the future of the entire territorial community. The mining company's wealth and political connections would be tested against the deep roots and fierce determination of people who had found their place in the world and would not be moved from it. The same forces that had once conspired to use two desperate people for their own advantage would now face the consequences of having created something far stronger and more dangerous than they had ever intended. The three hunting knives lay side by side on Jedediah's workbench, their hand-forged blades gleaming in the lamplight like promises of violence held in check. Each knife had been crafted specifically for one of his sons, Samuel's, with a longer blade for field dressing large game, Jacob's with a heavier spine for chopping through bone and cartilage, Ezra's with a more delicate point for precision work that required surgical accuracy. The custom leather sheaths bore each boy's initials burned into the hide, marking these weapons as personal tools that would serve them throughout their lives. "Why now?" Samuel asked, running his thumb carefully along his blade's edge to test its sharpness. At 15, he possessed his father's careful nature and his mother's intelligence, making him the natural strategist among the three brothers. "Because men are coming who mean to take everything we've built," Jedediah replied, applying a final coat of oil to Ezra's blade. "These knives won't stop bullets, but they'll serve you well in close quarters, and they'll remind you that a Cain man is never truly unarmed as long as he has steel and the will to use it." The mining company's ultimatum had arrived 3 days earlier, delivered by a well-dressed lawyer whose soft hands and nervous manner marked him as a man unaccustomed to the realities of frontier violence. The terms were simple and non-negotiable: accept $50,000 for immediate relocation, or face the consequences of continued resistance to legitimate development interests. No mention was made of the land's true value or the family's legal rights. Such niceties had been abandoned in favor of naked threats backed by hired guns. Jacob, now 13 and possessed of his father's physical strength despite his youth, hefted his knife with obvious satisfaction. "How many men are they bringing?" "Sheriff Morrison counts 8 so far," Jedediah answered, "but more arrive daily. Professional killers from Kansas and Colorado, men who specialize in removing obstacles to mining operations." Ezra, 11 but already showing the diplomatic instincts that would serve him throughout his life, studied the situation with the analytical approach he brought to all problems. "What about the territorial authorities? Surely they can't allow private armies to operate here." "The territorial authorities are bought and paid for," Ruthie said from her position near the stove, where she was preparing the kind of substantial meal that men needed before facing mortal danger. "The mining company has more money than the territorial government sees in 5 years. Legal protection is a luxury we can't afford to depend on." The homestead had been transformed into a fortress over the past week, with every building and approach route carefully prepared for the coming assault. Windows had been reinforced with heavy shutters that could stop rifle bullets while still allowing defensive fire. The root cellar had been expanded and stocked with enough supplies to sustain the family through a siege of several weeks. Most importantly, defensive positions had been established at key points around the property, each one offering overlapping fields of fire that would make any frontal assault extremely costly. Samuel's position commanded the main approach from the valley trail, his rifle rest carefully constructed to provide both concealment and stability for long-range shooting. His marksmanship had been honed through years of hunting, and his calm temperament made him ideal for the patient work of picking off attackers before they could reach effective range. Jacob's assignment was more aggressive, reflecting his preference for direct action over careful calculation. He would be responsible for the barn and livestock areas, where his strength and mobility would allow him to respond quickly to threats from multiple directions. His natural combativeness made him eager for the confrontation, though his parents worried that his enthusiasm might lead him to take unnecessary risks. Ezra's role reflected both his youth and his particular talents. He would serve as messenger and coordinator, moving between positions to relay information and coordinate defensive responses. His small size and natural agility made him difficult to target, while his intelligence and communication skills would be essential for maintaining family unity during the chaos of battle. Dr. Henderson's arrival at the homestead surprised no one who understood the bonds that had developed within the mountain community over the years. She brought medical supplies and professional expertise that could mean the difference between survival and death for anyone wounded in the coming fight. Her presence also represented a moral victory, proof that the Cain family retained allies even among the community's most respected citizens. "I've seen what mining company violence does to families," she told Ruthie as they organized medical supplies in the cabin's main room. "Broken bones, bullet wounds, burns from fires set to drive people away. I won't stand by and let it happen to you without offering what help I can." Sheriff Morrison's visit came under cover of darkness, his official neutrality requiring discretion about any assistance he might provide to either side. But his long friendship with the Cain family and his respect for their legal rights made his sympathies clear, even if his official position prevented open support. "I can't prevent what's coming," he told Jedediah as they stood in the shadow of the barn, away from prying eyes that might report his presence to the wrong people. "But I can tell you that the attack will come at dawn, probably day after tomorrow. They want to catch you sleeping and finish this before the territorial government has time to investigate." The information allowed for final preparations that could prove crucial to the family's survival. Defensive positions were adjusted to account for dawn lighting conditions, with particular attention to how the early morning sun would affect visibility and targeting. Supplies were redistributed to ensure that each position had everything needed for sustained resistance. Most importantly, contingency plans were developed for various scenarios: what to do if the main cabin was overrun, how to evacuate wounded family members, where to retreat if the defensive perimeter was breached. The night before the expected attack brought a strange calm to the homestead, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath before the storm. The family gathered for what might be their last meal together, sharing memories and affirmations of love that would sustain them through whatever ordeal lay ahead. The conversation was quiet and matter-of-fact, focusing on practical details rather than emotional farewells that might weaken their resolve. "Remember that we're fighting for more than just ourselves," Jedediah told his sons as they made final checks of their weapons and equipment. "Every family that's tried to build something decent in this territory is watching to see whether honest work and legal rights mean anything when they conflict with rich men's greed." Ruthie's contribution to their preparation was characteristically practical and profound. She had spent the day writing letters to be delivered in case the family didn't survive, the attack letters that documented the conspiracy they had uncovered, the violence that had been used against them, and the broader implications for territorial development. These documents would serve as testimony if the worst happened, ensuring that their story would be told truthfully regardless of the battle's outcome. "If we don't make it through tomorrow," she told Dr. Henderson, "make sure these letters reach the territorial capital. People need to know what happened here and why." The final hours before dawn were spent in quiet vigilance, with each family member taking position and making peace with whatever the day might bring. The hunting knives that had been crafted with such care were secured in their sheaths, ready to serve as weapons of last resort if the battle came down to close quarters combat. The rifles that would be their primary defense were loaded and checked one final time, their familiar weight and balance offering reassurance to hands that had learned their use through years of careful practice. As the first grey light began to touch the eastern peaks, the Cain family waited in their prepared positions, united by bonds that had been forged through shared struggle and tested by external pressure. They had built something worth defending, something that justified whatever sacrifice the coming hours might demand. The same determination that had transformed two discarded people into the foundation of a mountain community would now be tested against forces that measured value only in dollars and power only in terms of violence. The mining company's hired killers were about to discover that some things could not be bought, intimidated, or stolen. That love and determination, when combined with skill and preparation, could create a defense stronger than any fortress and more dangerous than any army they could afford to hire. The family Bible sat open on the kitchen table, its worn pages revealing the careful records that marked the passage of Cain generations' births, marriages, deaths, and the milestones that defined a family's journey through time. Ruthie's hand had recorded Samuel's birth in her careful script, followed by Jacob's and Ezra's entries, each one marking another link in the chain that connected past to future. The sacred book represented everything the mining company sought to destroy: continuity, legacy, and the spiritual foundation that made their mountain home more than just valuable real estate. The attack came with the dawn, just as Sheriff Morrison had predicted. 8 men rode up the valley trail in the grey half-light, their movements coordinated with the precision of soldiers who had conducted similar operations before. They approached openly, making no attempt at concealment, a calculated display of confidence meant to intimidate their targets into submission before the first shot was fired. Harrison Blackwood rode at the front of the group, his eastern suit replaced by practical riding clothes that still couldn't disguise his urban softness. Behind him came the hired Killershard men with scarred faces and cold eyes, carrying weapons with the casual familiarity of professionals who killed for money rather than passion. "Jedediah Cain!" Blackwood's voice carried clearly across the clearing as the riders stopped just outside rifle range. "I've come to make you a final offer that's more generous than you deserve after the trouble you've caused." Jedediah stepped onto the cabin's porch, his grandfather's rifle cradled in his arms, with deceptive casualness. Behind him, the shuttered windows concealed his family's defensive positions, creating the illusion that he faced the threat alone. His voice, when he replied, carried the quiet authority of a man defending his home. "State your business and be gone. You're not welcome on my land." "Your land?" Blackwood's laugh held no humor. "Mr. Cain, this conversation can end one of 2 ways. You can accept $75,000 and leave peacefully, or we can take what we need and leave your family to bury what's left of you. The choice is yours, but my patience is limited." The negotiation that followed was a formality both sides understood would lead to violence. Blackwood made increasingly threatening demands, while Jedediah's responses grew shorter and more defiant. The hired gunmen spread out during the conversation, taking positions that would allow them to surround the homestead once shooting began. Every movement was carefully calculated, every word designed to create the legal fiction that they had offered reasonable terms before resorting to force. "Last chance, Cain," Blackwood finally called. $75,000 and safe passage out of the territory. Refuse, and we'll take the land anyway and use your family's graves as boundary markers. Jedediah's response came not in words but in actions. He raised his rifle and put a bullet through the hat brim of the nearest gunman, close enough to part the man's hair, but deliberately missing flesh. The message was unmistakable. The Cain family was armed, accurate, and ready to defend their home with lethal force. The first gunman's return shot splintered wood from the porch post inches from Jedediah's head, and suddenly the mountain clearing erupted in the thunder of rifle fire and the whine of bullets seeking targets. Jedediah dove behind the protective barrier he had constructed, while muzzle flashes bloomed from the cabin's shuttered windows as his family joined the battle. Samuel's position in the loft commanded an excellent view of the attacker's movements, and his first shot dropped one of the gunmen from his saddle with the clean efficiency that years of hunting had taught him. His second shot wounded another man's horse, sending rider and mount tumbling in a confusion of screaming animal and cursing human that disrupted the attacker's initial assault. Jacob's aggressive nature served him well, as 2 gunmen tried to flank the family's position by approaching through the barn area. His rifle fire drove them back initially, but when they pressed their attack despite his accurate shooting, he abandoned his defensive position for a direct assault that caught them completely off guard. His hunting knife, crafted by his father's careful hands, found its mark twice before the surviving attacker retreated in panic. The battle's intensity surprised even the professional killers, who had expected to overwhelm a family of mountain farmers rather than engage trained marksmen fighting from prepared positions. Their casualties mounted quickly: 2 dead, 3 wounded, and morale cracking under the realization that their easy money had become a life-or-death struggle against opponents who knew their business. Blackwood's role in the assault was supervisory rather than combative, a fact that became obvious when he ordered his remaining men to set fire to the cabin while staying well back from the rifle fire himself. The burning brand thrown onto the roof represented a new level of desperation arson that would destroy the evidence of the mining company's involvement while eliminating the family that threatened their plans. Ruthie's response to the fire threat demonstrated the steel core that had enabled her to survive and thrive in circumstances that would have broken a weaker person. While bullets whined overhead, she organized a bucket brigade using water from the emergency barrels stored throughout the cabin, coordinating her family's firefighting efforts with the same calm efficiency she brought to cooking and household management. "Samuel, keep them pinned down while we deal with the fire," she called to her eldest son. "Jacob, get back to your position, they're trying to flank us again. Ezra, help me with these buckets." Dr. Henderson proved her courage by leaving the cabin's relative safety to tend a wounded attacker who lay groaning in the clearing between the opposing forces. Her medical oath compelled her to treat the injured regardless of which side they fought for, and her brave action created a temporary lull in the shooting as both sides held their fire rather than risk hitting a woman performing an act of mercy. The wounded man's gratitude was pathetic and revealing. "Lady, you got to help me," he pleaded as Dr. Henderson worked to stop his bleeding. "That mining company, son of a bitch, promised us easy money for scaring off some mountain farmers. Didn't tell us we'd be fighting people who shoot back like this." His words, carried clearly in the mountain air, confirmed what the Cain family had suspected about their attackers' motivation and preparation. These were not ideological enemies or personal adversaries. They were hired killers who had been lied to about the nature of their assignment and the competence of their intended victims. The revelation seemed to affect the remaining gunmen's determination. Professional killers were pragmatic about danger, willing to accept reasonable risks for appropriate compensation, but quick to reassess when casualties mounted beyond acceptable levels. The realization that they had been misled about their target's capabilities created the kind of doubt that could shatter morale completely. Blackwood sensed the shift in his hired gun's attitude and made the mistake that would ultimately doom his entire operation. Rather than cutting his losses and withdrawing, he offered a bounty that revealed both his desperation and the true scope of the mining company's resources. $5,000 to the man who brings me Jedediah Cain's head," he shouted across the clearing. $10,000 if you bring me the whole family." The bounty had the opposite effect from what Blackwood intended. Instead of motivating his remaining men to greater efforts, it confirmed their suspicions that they had been deceived about the assignment's nature and importance. Professional killers understood that legitimate business disputes didn't warrant such extreme payments, and the excessive bounty suggested that their employer was involved in something far more complex and dangerous than they had been told. The collection of healing herbs hung in neat bundles from the cabin rafters, their earthy fragrance, a testament to Ruthie's transformation from helpless charity case to essential keeper of mountain wisdom. Willow bark for pain, echinacea for infection, yarrow for bleeding wounds. Each plant represented knowledge hard-won through years of learning from the mountain's natural pharmacy. Now, as bullets shattered the morning calm and smoke began to rise from the cabin's roof, these humble remedies might prove the difference between life and death for her family. The decisive phase of the battle began when Ezra, moving between defensive positions with messages and supplies, spotted something that changed everything. From his vantage point near the root cellar, he could see what the adults had missed in their focus on the immediate threat: Sheriff Morrison and a posse of Territorial marshals approaching through the forest, drawn by the sound of sustained gunfire that could be heard for miles in the thin mountain air. "Papa!" he called, his young voice carrying clearly despite the chaos. "Look toward the south, ridge help is coming." The sight of official reinforcements transformed the battle's dynamics completely. Blackwood's hired killers, already demoralized by their unexpected casualties and their employer's deception, found themselves caught between the Cain family's deadly accurate defensive fire and a force of Territorial law enforcement that would leave them no escape route. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Professional gunmen could accept the risks of fighting mountain farmers, defending their homes, but engaging territorial marshals meant facing not just death, but the certainty that their families would receive no compensation if they fell. The distinction between legal and illegal violence became suddenly and crucially important to men who had spent their careers walking that fine line. "This is turning into a massacre," one of the surviving gunmen shouted to Blackwood. "You didn't tell us we'd be fighting the territorial government." Blackwood's response revealed the desperation of a man whose carefully laid plans were collapsing around him. "Finish the job and there won't be any witnesses to tell the territorial government anything." But his words carried no conviction, and his remaining men began a fighting withdrawal that quickly became a rout as Sheriff Morrison's posse closed the trap. The mining company's overwhelming advantage in numbers and resources had evaporated, leaving them exposed and vulnerable in hostile territory with no legal protection for their actions. The moment of greatest danger came when one of the fleeing gunmen, panicked by the approaching law enforcement and enraged by his wounds, decided to take at least one member of the Cain family with him. He circled back toward the cabin, using the smoke from the roof fire as concealment, his rifle aimed at Ruthie as she organized the bucket brigade that was preventing their home from burning down completely. Jedediah saw the threat developing and reacted with the instantaneous decision-making that had kept him alive through 7 years of mountain dangers. His shot, fired while moving at a dead run across open ground, took the gunman center mass and sent him tumbling backward into the creek, where his blood turned the clear mountain water temporarily red. The sight of her husband exposing himself to mortal danger for her safety triggered something primal in Ruthie's response. Rather than cowering behind cover, she grabbed one of Jedediah's spare rifles and began providing covering fire with an accuracy that surprised even her own family. Her marksmanship, learned through years of hunting small game for the family table, proved devastatingly effective against human targets who had underestimated the fighting spirit of frontier women. "That's my wife," Jedediah shouted with fierce pride as Ruthie's shots drove the last of the attackers into full retreat. Mountain-bred and mountain-tested, Sheriff Morrison's arrival with his posse marked the end of organized resistance, but it also created the most dangerous moment of the entire confrontation. Blackwood, faced with capture and the certainty of territorial prosecution for attempted murder and conspiracy, made a final desperate gamble. He produced a hidden derringer and aimed it at Samuel, calculating that killing one of the Cain children would either break the family's spirit or provoke them into illegal retaliation that would discredit their legal position. The shot that prevented this atrocity came from an unexpected source. Dr. Henderson, who had spent the battle tending wounded men from both sides, had positioned herself where she could observe Blackwood's movements. Her pocket pistol, small but deadly at close range, put an end to the mining company representative's threat with the surgical precision she brought to all her professional activities. "Some infections," she observed calmly as Blackwood's body settled into the mountain dirt, "require immediate amputation to prevent them from spreading." The aftermath of the battle revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had threatened the Cain family. Documents found in Blackwood's saddlebags detailed a plan that extended far beyond their individual homestead to encompass most of the territory's mineral-rich areas. The mining company had intended to use violence and legal manipulation to seize dozens of family farms, creating a pattern of dispossession that would have transformed the entire region into a corporate colony. Sheriff Morrison's investigation, supported by the territorial marshals and the documentary evidence the battle had produced, exposed corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. The same politicians who had been expected to look the other way while mining companies seized private property found themselves facing federal prosecution for conspiracy and racketeering. "This goes all the way to the territorial capital," Morrison told the Cain family as they surveyed the damage to their homestead. "Men we trusted to uphold the law were taking mining company money to subvert it instead." The legal victory that followed was as complete as their military triumph had been decisive. The mining company's claims were invalidated, their political allies were removed from office, and the Cain family's property rights were confirmed by territorial courts that could no longer ignore the evidence of corporate malfeasance. But the most significant victory was less tangible: the transformation of community relationships that the battle had precipitated. Neighbors who had been intimidated into neutrality by mining company pressure now openly supported the family that had stood against outside exploitation. The network of mutual assistance that characterized healthy frontier communities was restored and strengthened by the shared recognition that they had all been targets of the same predatory scheme. Mayor Holbrook and Councilman Davies, their roles in the original conspiracy exposed by the captured documents, found themselves ostracized by the same community they had tried to manipulate. Their replacement by men who understood that a community's strength came from supporting its members rather than exploiting them marked a fundamental shift in Cedar Falls' political culture. The healing that followed, both physical and emotional, demonstrated the wisdom Ruthie had accumulated during her years of learning mountain medicine. Her herb collections treated not just bullet wounds and burns, but the deeper trauma that violence always inflicted on communities. Her gentle ministrations to former enemies who had been wounded in the battle created bonds of gratitude that helped prevent the cycle of revenge that often followed such confrontations. "Healing is healing," she explained to Samuel, who questioned why they should help men who had tried to kill them. "Hatred is like infection, it spreads if you don't treat it properly." The victory established the Cain family as more than successful homesteaders. They had become symbols of resistance to the kind of corporate exploitation that threatened frontier communities throughout the West. Their story spread through the territorial press and beyond, inspiring other families to stand firm against similar pressures and encouraging territorial governments to strengthen protections for individual property rights. As winter settled over their mountain home, the scars of battle were already healing under Ruthie's care, and the family's unified determination to rebuild what had been damaged. The herbs that had helped them survive the confrontation would continue to serve their community's needs, part of the legacy of knowledge and resistance that would be passed to future generations, along with the land they had fought to protect. The hand-carved wooden sign stood at the entrance to their valley, its simple message weathered but still legible after 5 years of mountain seasons. Cain Family Homestead, established 1847. The sign represented more than mere identification. It marked the transformation of wilderness into home, of desperate arrangement into lasting legacy, of 2 discarded people into the foundation of a thriving mountain community. Samuel Cain, now 20 and married to the daughter of a neighboring homesteader, guided his own wagon up the familiar trail toward his childhood home. His wife Mary sat beside him, their infant son sleeping peacefully in her arms, despite the wagon's gentle swaying. The baby bore the Cain family's distinctive grey eyes and his grandfather's determined chin, marking him as the 4th generation to call these mountains home. "Tell me again about the early days," Mary asked as they approached the expanded homestead that bore little resemblance to the simple cabin where Samuel had been born. "About how your parents met and what it was like when you were children." Samuel smiled, understanding that his wife's questions served a deeper purpose than mere curiosity. She was weaving herself into the family's oral history, claiming her place in the continuing story that connected past to future. The tale had been told countless times, but each telling revealed new details and deeper meanings that made it fresh again. "Papa says the town council thought they were playing the cruelest joke imaginable," he began, settling into the familiar rhythm of family storytelling, "giving a mountain hermit a woman they figured would be dead or gone before spring. But Mama didn't just survive. She made Papa realize that what he'd thought was strength was really just fear dressed up in fur and silence." The homestead that came into view as they crested the final ridge showcased the prosperity that determined work and family unity could create. The original cabin had been expanded into a substantial house with multiple rooms, wide porches, and the kind of architectural details that spoke of pride in permanent residence rather than temporary shelter. Additional buildings, barn, workshop, smokehouse, and guest quarters clustered around the main house like satellites around a planet, each one serving essential functions in the complex economy of mountain life. Jacob emerged from the barn as they approached, his powerful frame still carrying the direct energy that had made him such an effective defender during the mining company conflict. At 18, he had assumed primary responsibility for the family's livestock operations and the expanded trading relationships that now connected their homestead to markets as distant as Denver and St. Louis. His greeting to Samuel and Mary mixed genuine warmth with the kind of rough humor that characterized relationships between brothers who had faced mortal danger together. "About time you showed up," he called, wiping his hands on a leather apron stained with the honest work of animal husbandry. "Papa's been pacing like a caged bear, and Mama's cooked enough food to feed half the territory." Ezra's arrival from the house demonstrated the diplomatic skills that had made him the family's natural representative in territorial politics. At 16, he already served as an unofficial mediator in disputes between homesteading families, and his name was frequently mentioned as a potential candidate for territorial legislature when he reached the required age. His manner combined his father's quiet authority with his mother's gift for understanding what people needed to hear. "Samuel," he called, his voice carrying the genuine joy that family reunions always brought. "Wait until you see what Papa's built in the new workshop. And Mama's been experimenting with a new recipe for preserving fruit that could revolutionize our trading relationships with the railroad towns." The family gathering that evening exemplified the depth and complexity that their relationships had achieved over the years. 3 generations shared the dinner table: Jedediah and Ruthie, now in their 50s but still vigorous and clearly devoted to each other. Their 3 sons, each carving out his own path while remaining connected to the family enterprise. And the newest additions, the spouses and children who represented the future of the Cain legacy in the territory. The conversation ranged across topics that reflected their expanded influence and interests. Samuel reported on territorial politics and the growing pressure for statehood that could transform their region within the decade. Jacob discussed livestock breeding programs and the potential for expanded mining operations under family control rather than external exploitation. Ezra shared intelligence about railroad development and the opportunities it would create for families positioned to take advantage of improved transportation. But the evening's most significant moment came when Jedediah presented his newest grandson with a gift that connected the boy to his family's history and future. The small wooden rattle, carved from the same pine that had provided lumber for the original cabin, bore intricate designs that told the story of the mountain seasons and the wildlife that shared their valley. "Every Cain child gets one of these," he explained to Mary as the baby gripped the rattle with surprising strength. "Carved from trees that grew on our land, shaped by hands that built everything you see around you. When he's old enough to understand, we'll teach him the stories these symbols represent." Ruthie's contribution to the evening was characteristically practical and profound. She had spent the afternoon updating the family Bible's records, adding Mary's name to the marriage entries and the new baby's birth to the continuing chronicle of Cain family growth. Her careful handwriting connected the present moment to the day she had first opened that sacred book as a frightened young woman with no family and few prospects. "Hard to believe it's been 15 years since we fought off the mining company," she observed, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had lived to see justice prevail. "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if we'd given up, taken their money and moved on." "We'd have lost more than the land," Jedediah replied, his arm around her shoulders in the comfortable gesture of a couple whose love had deepened through shared trials. "We'd have lost the knowledge that some things are worth fighting for, worth dying for if necessary." The transformation of their relationship with Cedar Falls provided perhaps the most satisfying evidence of their ultimate victory. The same town that had once dismissed Ruthie as worthless and manipulated both of them for narrow advantage now sought their leadership on issues affecting the entire territory's development. Mayor Holbrook and Councilman Davies were distant memories, replaced by men who understood that a community's strength came from supporting its most determined members rather than exploiting them. Sheriff Morrison, now in his 70s but still serving with the quiet competence that had made him a trusted ally, stopped by during the family gathering to share news from the Territorial capital. His presence demonstrated the respect the Cain family commanded throughout the region and the role they had come to play in shaping territorial policy. "Statehood's coming," he told them over coffee and Ruthie's famous apple pie. "Maybe 2 years, maybe 5, but it's inevitable now. When it happens, people are going to remember who stood up to outside exploitation and who sold out for mining company money." The political implications were clear without being explicitly stated. The Cain family's principled resistance to corporate intimidation had established them as natural leaders in the movement towards statehood and self-governance. Their story of transformation from society's discards to territorial leaders would resonate with voters who valued independence and integrity over political connections and corporate influence. As the evening drew to a close and the family prepared to settle into the comfortable routines of mountain hospitality, Jedediah and Ruthie walked out onto the porch to observe the valley that had become their kingdom. The signs of prosperity and permanence spread before them like physical proof of what love and determination could accomplish against any odds. "No regrets?" Ruthie asked, the question she had posed periodically throughout their marriage, always receiving the same answer but needing to hear it confirmed. "Only that it took so long for us to find each other," Jedediah replied, his response carrying the accumulated weight of 15 years of shared joys and sorrows. "Everything else, the struggle, the danger, the uncertainty of it, was worth it to end up here, with you, with our family." The wooden sign at their valley's entrance would weather many more seasons, its simple message growing more meaningful with each passing year. Future generations of Cains would read those carved words and understand that they represented more than dates and names. They marked the spot where two people had refused to accept the world's judgment about their worth, and had judgment is Revis, created something beautiful from what others had discarded. The same townsfolk who had once laughed at the cruel joke of pairing a mountain hermit with a worthless woman now spoke of the Cain family with the respect reserved for those who had proven that love, when combined with determination and courage, could overcome any obstacle and create legacies that would endure long after their creators had returned to the mountain soil that had nurtured their dreams. In the end, their story had become exactly what the best stories should be: proof that what the world calls worthless can become unshakable when shaped by love, land, and time.